Hi, Bellarmine. Hi, Bellarmine. This is Ms. Minharis. You can tell this is my first webinar, but at least I'm not muted right now because that's what I usually do in my classes. I wanted to start today and just welcome all of you and say how thrilled we are to have Jamie Ford here with us today to talk a little bit about our Bellarmine Read Selection, Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. We're going to start with Mr. Ford and his comments and just kind of his who knows what he's going to talk about, all sorts of things. After we're done with that, we have some questions that a number of you have submitted in advance that Malia Kaiser's going to help us with. And then we'll open it up for more general questions. If there are other things that come up, those will be in the Q&A section, and Malia and I will help moderate those. Okay, so we're super happy to have you. I want to let you know that we are recording the webinar, but the only part of the webinar that's being recorded is the panelists that you see right now. You are not being recorded, so you don't need to worry about that if you're feeling shy. All right. So just a little bit about Jamie Ford. Every year, as you know, in your Bellarmine experience, the English department has selected a novel or a piece of nonfiction for us to read as a community. And this year, all the way back in last September and October, Ms. Hannigan, Ms. Henderson, and I were really thinking about this novel, Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, and wondering if maybe that would be a good selection for our community to read. We used to teach this novel in 9th grade and had to make a change, but we're really happy to have stepped back into that again together as a community. Mr. Ford is a Pacific Northwest native. I believe he went to South Kitsap High School, but he'll correct me if I'm wrong. Attended Seattle University for a bit and has been living and working as a writer for a couple of decades, maybe at least a decade, at least over a decade. And when Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet was first published in 2009, it just made a huge splash and was on a number of lists, including the Best Book Club pick of the American Booksellers Association. I think that's right. And so Mr. Ford continues to write, and he also is an active voice in social justice through his social media platforms, and we're just thrilled to have him join us. So, Mr. Ford, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I did go to South Kitsap. I have sat in the football stands at Bellarmine many decades ago in the cold, watching us lose. So I have been on campus briefly. Wow, there's 797 people. I love this. I wrote Hotel. I was very naive when I wrote Hotel. I wrote it as, I really wrote it for myself. There's a writer that I was inspired by when I was in high school named Harlan Ellison, and he said, you should always write for the wisest, wittiest, most intelligent audience in the universe. Write for yourself. And I really wrote the book as an exploration of my own identity and my own family. I'm half Chinese on my dad's side. My great-grandfather was a man named Min Chung, and he came to this country around 1865, and he worked for a silver mine in Nevada. And around 1890, he changed his name to William Ford. And so I'm like the last of the Chinese Fords. And it's weird when you go through life being biracial, because you have one foot in two different cultures. And growing up, I never felt entirely comfortable in either culture. Among my Chinese family, I just didn't feel Chinese enough because my dad spoke Cantonese fluently, and I basically, speak toddler Cantonese, if that. And then on the Caucasian side of my family, my mom was from Arkansas. I just never felt white enough. And there were moments where I grew up in a very Chinese American household, and my Caucasian friends would come over and we're eating some, chicken feet or something that's very Chinese. And suddenly as sixth grader, I realized I'm different. I'm not like everybody else. And that hasn't changed. Even as an adult, I'm still trying to figure out where I fit in. And sometimes I feel very comfortable in my own skin, and other times I'm still racked with questions and self-doubt. I do want to show a photo, and this is just the first photo. It's my ID from Seattle University, if you don't mind calling that up, Chelsea. Um, it's strange being a kid who, I'll wait till you pop that up, if it's possible, if you can hear me. Well, the point I was going to make is when I was very young, I looked, oop, there you go. When I was very young, I looked very Chinese. And so I looked Chinese enough that when I was in grade school, I was called a chink. And so I was Chinese enough to earn racial slurs. And yet as an adult, I'm very white passing. And so I'm white enough to be in the company of white people who think I'm so white they tell racist jokes in front of me. And that journey has just been perplexing. Um, I actually spoke at a high school in Texas a couple of years ago, and it was a very affluent, almost predominantly white high school, like 2,000 kids, and maybe there were 20 people of color in the entire school. And kids there on social media called me a chink. And I think I look more Chinese the more weight I lose. And so when they called me a chink, I wasn't that insulted. I was just like, oh, did I lose weight? But it was really strange that even today that these things kind of haunt me. Let's go to the next one, number 2. This is me in college. And the weird thing about being biracial is you're often confronted with forms or applications, and they ask you what your race is. And there was never a box for Hapa or half or mixed. I always had to choose, like, am I Asian today? Am I white today? Which parent do I like more today? It was perpetually challenging. Let's jump to the next one. This is me and my mom. So here I am, Jamie, half Chinese guy. And I kind of could be white passing. I think most Asian people know that I'm Hapa, but a lot of Caucasian people, I just sort of fly under the radar. And yet in this next photo, this is me with my Chinese family. I'm in the back there. I look very Chinese. And so it's so weird growing up and really not knowing who you are, where you belong, and people perceive you differently all the time. When I was at Seattle University, I remember walking across campus, and there was this quad, and on the far side was a guy who was half Asian, just like me. And instead of going on the sidewalks, we crossed and met in the middle, and we just sort of stared at each other like, right? Look at us. We're different. Yet you and I are the same. And now places like Seattle University and most major universities have centers for diversity, which is wonderful, where people can sort of go and feel comfortable and commingle with people that are on that same journey of self-discovery. I was at Central Michigan University as they opened their Center for Diversity. And a white student came in and, he had to ask. He asked the director of Center for Diversity, why aren't there white cultural centers on campus? And she looked at him and said, there have been white cultural centers on campuses for 150 years. They're called fraternities. And that was kind of an appropriate answer. So it's interesting now that there are spaces for us to sort of explore who we are. Let's jump to the next one just a little bit. And this is my great-grandfather, Min Chung, on the left, and that's me on the right, which I just find so fascinating because he was 100% Chinese, and here I am, and we look very similar. So you can only run so far from your genetics. Let's just sort of jump back to me for a moment, and I'll just sort of leave those photos on the side, just because I can see myself talking to my hands. There we go. And so, I wrote Hotel. Really, there's father and son things in there. It's a love story. I'm partial to love stories. But it's also kind of a deep dive into, what it means to be a young Asian American growing up. And since the book has came out, I've visited lots of schools, but I've also visited a lot of ESL classes, English as a Second Language, which when I was first invited to an ESL class, I just assumed everyone would be Chinese or Japanese or some various, I expected an Asian audience. And I walked in, and everyone who was reading this book and had similar experiences of identity and assimilation. They were from Bahrain, they were from Pakistan, they were from Kenya, they were from the Philippines, they were from all over. And so I think we will, as long as this country has people coming to it from other places and diverse cultures, we're always going to have people searching for who they are and where they belong in American society. And so I wrote this book really as a love letter to this old neighborhood, kind of as an exploration of my father's identity. My dad was 12 years old at the time of Pearl Harbor, and he wore one of those buttons that read, "I am Chinese," and he talked about walking to school and the white kids throwing rocks at him and calling him a Jap. And so there's little subtleties of race and experience that we just don't see in history textbooks. And so I wrote it for me, but it became something more than that to other people, which is fascinating. It's since been published in like 36 languages. It was the #1 book in Norway for 4 months, and there's not a lot of Asian people in Norway. So I found that especially fascinating. So I think we're at a time where people are ready to get out of their lanes and read about other people's experiences, whether that's in music or film or literature. And so I think in that way, the book's been very useful. I don't just consider myself an author. I really, the more I thought about it, and I look at all of my books, I consider myself someone in the compassion creation business. And right now, there's a deficit in our culture of understanding, of empathy. And I do think when you write a certain type of book or you create a certain type of film and you inject that into the bloodstream of America, you can inoculate people against prejudice and racism and bigotry and homophobia and a lot of things that are just super divisive, and that make that division and our tendency to break off into tribes is basically going to lead to conflict, and that kind of sucks. So I do think my role as a writer, while I set out to write this book really for myself, the book has taken on an occupation of its own and is doing its own thing despite my own intentions for the book, and I'm happy to see that happen. But still, I'm very passionate about issues when it comes to race and understanding and acceptance, because I still run into problems. My book has been optioned for a Broadway musical, and we've hit a huge snag because there is a producer, and I just had a call about this yesterday. The producer is known for producing a musical about Jane Austen, and Jane Austen, that experience is set in the 1800s. It's an all-white cast, and so their producing team was all white. And so when that producer was asked, well, about diversity, she said, we don't need diversity because it's an all-white production. Well, they have an all-white producing team for Hotel, and that's kind of a problem for me. And I'm like, can't you see the point I'm trying to make? Like, this is a story whose main characters are Chinese, Japanese, and Black, and all of the producers are Caucasian. And there's nothing wrong with that. They can have the empathy and the compassion to tell that story. But I think it's helpful to have another voice in that room. There was a song composed about mochi, and those of you who are Asian, especially Japanese, you know what mochi is. And a Caucasian producer is not going to write a song about mochi. And it was really cool. And it was a way of sharing this bit of a cultural identity with everybody. And then they can go to a Wajimaya, they can buy it, and they can enjoy it. But just the fact that this musical has come to a screeching halt because the producers don't understand why I would want someone with a diverse, the producing team to have at least a little bit of the representation of who's in the book. And it's not, if you talk about microaggressions, I tend not to dive into the whole world of microaggressions. I step back and I look at, if you just don't understand someone's point of view and you are willfully ignorant and you don't want to understand, that in and of itself is a microaggression. It's just a lack of understanding. And it's like what Martin Luther King wrote a famous letter when he was in a Birmingham jail. And just to paraphrase, the heart of what he was saying was that it's not bad people who do bad things that make the world a difficult place. It's good people who just don't care and ignore it and do nothing. And I think we're seeing that attitude's been sown in our country, for 100 years, and finally we're reaping what we've sown all these years. So anyway, I suppose I should answer some questions. I can, as you'll realize, I can prattle on about a lot of these things that I'm very passionate about. But I want to be most helpful to the people who are part of this Zoom. So would you like to just dive into the questions that are on the list, or would one of the moderators like to offer a question?
Yeah. Okay. What type of research did you have to do in order to write the book? Was it academic or personal stories, a little bit of both?
Boy, it was everything. It's, part of the research just came from being half Chinese and growing up in a Chinese American household. The research, kind of the nuts and bolts research, I read every nonfiction book I could find on the Japanese internment, but I also collected maps and ephemera, just brochures and things like that, menus and items from the international district going back to the 40s, so I could see what that area looked like at that time, because the interstate wasn't there. So Japantown and Chinatown looked vastly different. I joined the Dinsho Foundation, which records the oral history of the Japanese internment experience. I went to Minidoka. I'd been to Minidoka several times before I even started writing the book. But even with that, I still had more questions. And so I tracked down several people who were historians in that area, and I called up a man named Doug Chin, and he was a historian and an activist. He must have been in his 80s at that time. And I told him I wanted to interview him for this book I'm writing. He had no idea what I was working on. And he said, why don't we meet for tea at the Panama Hotel? And I met Doug there, and it was fantastic. And at some point, I had an awareness of the Panama Hotel, but even I didn't realize that those items are still there to this day. And when I found that out, I really wanted to go to the basement. And so I called the owner of the hotel. The great thing now is I can hold up lots of books and say, like, I'm a best-selling author, and museums return my calls. Back then, I was just a crazy person. Like, I had, the credibility of like a 40-year-old guy playing bass guitar in my basement or something like that. No one was listening to me. And the owner of the hotel was very dismissive of me at the time. And so I flew to Seattle, and I just basically parked it in the tea room and tried to talk to her. And I was there for hours, and she finally sat down and was like, what's going on? I said, I really want to take a tour. I'd like to go to the basement. She said, we only do tours with a minimum of 8 people. And that was kind of like my brush off. And I said, okay. And I paid for 8 people, and I went on a tour by myself. And then we ended up spending 3 hours in the basement, and she really understood what I was working on. And then since when, we've been friends ever since. And I talked to Jan, the owner, quite often. But it was also just in the DNA of my childhood. I didn't realize it at the time, but someone who was in my childhood in grade school, I went to a public grade school. There were very few kids of color. I was half Chinese. My best friend was half Japanese. His name was Todi Anada. And I spent sleepovers, countless nights at the Anada's house. And Todi's dad would tell us these really cool ghost stories. I knew he was some kind of writer, but because he was always at his typewriter, he worked from home. I didn't know what he was about. And as I was beginning my research, I bumped into Todi's dad. It turns out he's a man named Lawson Anada. He was Oregon's poet laureate and is very famous for writing books of poetry about the Japanese internment. And so I was kind of surrounded by all of this. Even after college, I worked for the Bainbridge Review, and I was an art director for this newspaper. And my editor came in, and he was so excited. And he said, I got the original editor from the Review to come in, and he's going to write a guest column. And I'm like, okay, so I'm like 20 years old and I'm impressed by nothing. So into my own little world. And he's like, you don't understand. This is a man named Walt Woodward. And when the Japanese community was being taken from Bainbridge Island and sent to internment camps, he was the only newspaper editor on the West Coast writing against the internment in the face of treason charges. And so the FBI came in and said, if you keep writing this, we're going to shut you down. And he was like, treason it is. And he just kept on writing. He's a real hero in that community. And so I've been bumping up against this story for most of my life. It just took me a while to reach adulthood, where I kind of took the blinders off and paid attention to what was going on, and a lot of that lent itself to the story. Boy, that was a long answer for a very short question, but sorry. The next one I'll just say, yeah.
What was your inspiration to add Sheldon's character?
Oh, the inspiration to add Sheldon. I try my best to recreate the neighborhood, and because of redlining, because of the economic realities of how people of color were treated, people lived in the same neighborhood. And so you had Nihonmachi, Japantown, and kind of to the east, you had the Central District, which was, the African-American community, a Black community. And so all of these people of color are kind of together in this one area in Seattle. And I remember walking up and down the streets of Chinatown, the ID as it is now, and my grandpa would point to these Chinese restaurants and he'd say, like, Cab Calloway played here or Ella Fitzgerald played there. These were these great, famous jazz legends. And I didn't believe him, because part of a grandparent's job is to exaggerate to your children. And so I'm just like, whatever. And then once I was doing this research, I realized there were 38 jazz clubs on South Jackson, running from down in Pioneer Square all the way up to the Central District. And so you have all of these cultures together, and to recreate that neighborhood and to leave Black people out of the equation would have been false. And so Sheldon's really there to represent the people who were there. And I tend not to write characters based on other people, but I find in retrospect that some of my own personal experiences maybe subconsciously bleed onto the page. And when I was in high school, when I was at South Kitsap, when I was a sophomore, one of my best friends was a man named David Lewis, who was star basketball player, Black guy. And we worked together at the same restaurant as busboys. And he always used to introduce people and say that we were brothers. Like, can't you tell? We're related. And some of that manifests itself in the book. Good question.
Okay, since you grew up around here, what are your feelings about the Puyallup Fairground and its history with the Japanese internment camps?
Oh, the Puyallup for so long was emblematic of American history. It was just all white, and the experiences of people of color were unnoticed. And I participated in that. I went to the Puyallup many times and rode the scary roller coaster and ate the scones. And I had no idea it was a temporary internment camp until I was doing this research. So even my knowledge was very wide and not very deep. And since then, they've commemorated it. There's a plaque and things like that. And so they've sort of accepted its place in history. And I think that's helpful, because the more we sweep these things under the rug, the less understanding we have of other people's experiences, and the more potential to recreate those injustices in the future, which is something that I think most of us want to avoid. And so I think it's important that people remember that. It doesn't mean you shouldn't go to the Puyallup and enjoy it, but I think ignorance is poisonous, and if you just don't acknowledge things in the past, usually the net results down the road are negative.
Why did you decide to make the character Samantha, Marty's fiance, white?
I guess because my dad married a white woman, and it was weird growing up. That didn't seem unusual to me, and then at some point I realized the only Chinese guys I knew who had white wives were my dad and Bruce Lee. That was it. I didn't know anybody else. It was really not a common pairing. And so I wanted to represent that because, and one of my dad's cousins married a Japanese woman. And so seeing how we've been in this country since the 1800s, we don't have a lot of the animus between Chinese and Japanese cultures that someone on mainland China and Japan might have today. But I really wanted to represent the next generation because when I lived in Hawaii for a number of years and worked there. I worked with a woman who was Chinese, and she married a Japanese man, and her parents refused to attend the wedding. And this was 1993. This is not 1943. And so there's a generation that they hold on to this cultural baggage, and yet their children go to school together, they play together, they date, intermarry, and they don't understand what the big deal was to the previous generation. And I wanted to represent that in Marty and Samantha. Thanks, good question.
If you were Henry, would you still want to see Keiko after all those years spent apart?
If I was Henry, yeah, of course. I think it was a line I wrote in my last book where I said, there are people in our lives who are like Halley's Comet. They come around once, or if we're lucky, twice in a lifetime, and they affect our gravity. And it's interesting. Someone asked me once at an event. I was in Paulsville, Washington, and I'm in an auditorium, and they asked if there was a Keiko in my life, and I generally say the correct answer is I married the Keiko in my life. That's usually the best thing to say. But I did. I had like this, my first love, high school girlfriend. Everything was, super intense and as jangled and strange as high school romances can be. And I was telling the story of this important date I had with this person in high school. And I looked up into the audience, and she was there. I hadn't seen her since I was like 19 years old. It was crazy. And so, yeah, I mean, I always say there's a reason people lose 10 pounds before their class reunions. You're going to bump into these people that meant so much to you, and you kind of want to be at your best. Not that you're going to run off with this person, but you're strangely, through your shared history, connected in a way. And if I was Henry, I'd love to see Keiko again. Thank you. Just scrolling through all the crazy questions.
So, Mr. Ford, there are a lot of really good questions in the Q&A, and a couple that have come up, and I'm going to try to combine them. One ties back to your earlier comment about being in the compassion creation, not really thinking of yourself as a writer, but being in the compassion creation business. And a number of people are wondering kind of how do you see your work moving us toward being a more empathetic community? What are some ideas you might have for us as a high school community, or for us as also a community that's based in the Jesuit tradition, that we might work toward being more empathetic and more understanding of each other, who are people who are different from us?
A short answer would be just to be curious in life and understand it's not the responsibility of other people to educate you. It's your responsibility to educate yourself. And if you are curious, you're going to be more receptive to that information. If someone is just bombing your social media with opinions or facts that you are not comfortable with or not aware with, that's not always as digestible as when you seek it out yourself. And so if there's something going on in the world that you disagree with, ask yourself, what's the motivating factor? Why? When in the last election cycle, much was made of this caravan of refugees and immigrants from Honduras. And it was described in the media as an invasion, Like they're coming here to, take our jobs and rape people, and they're all drug dealers, and they're gonna whatever. You insert bigoted stereotype, and people held those views. I thought it was more important to ask, why are they leaving? Not, why are they arriving? Why are they leaving? Why are the conditions in their country so bad that they're going to travel 1,500 miles on foot with just what they could carry and then risk being detained for years in a detention center? And then if you look at the taproot of that history, you look at how that country was, the political history of that country is messy, and we're part of the mess. And so in situations like Iran, people will say, this is a country that hates freedom. Okay, maybe there are people in Iran that really hate America. I don't think they hate us because we have freedom. Iran was a democracy, and we toppled their democracy in the 50s for oil. And so there's real reasons why they dislike us, and it's not what you read and hear in the news. And I think that's why I like writing historical fiction, because there's things getting lost in the shuffle. I've done a lot of book events for Hotel, and there will be a sweet cotton-haired woman who was a child during World War II, and will come up to me and say, well, I know it was terrible that we interred all these people, but there were Japanese spies. That's all been proven false. And it's not sometimes the falsehoods that trouble me, but it's half-truths that trouble me. And so when the case was made of why we should incarcerate all these Japanese people, most of whom were American citizens, there were things, the evidence was, well, they had maps of the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, so they must be up to no good. That sounds nefarious on its face, but the truth was those maps were in Life magazine, just on their coffee table. And so half-truths are really dangerous. Full truths, you sort of end up enlightened and you understand the reality, but people can shape that for their own, nefarious devices. I think as an author, I do write emotional stories. I mean, there are authors that write American Psycho, which is just, a pastiche of violence. And there are literary reasons why people do that. I don't have an interest in that. I'd rather write about the human condition and, the cliche about the human heart in conflict with itself is really interesting to me. Family drama is really interesting to me, and I think people can relate to that. And I think when you partake of that, it expands your empathy muscles. And sometimes I read or watch really sad stories, and I think it's okay. I don't read it to depress myself. I do it because I want an emotional workout. I want to feel something and then kind of ruminate on those feelings. And so I try to write those kind of books, but from a top-down view, I just try to be inclusive. I was invited to, I don't know if anyone out there remembers, you might have missed the generational window, but there were these books called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. There were 3 books. They were mega bestsellers for like grade school kids, and they were all these spooky stories based on myth and folklore, wildly popular. And I was invited to contribute a story for this commemorative edition, and all these authors contributed stories, and it was sort of an homage to those books. And I'm basically writing a middle grade horror story. And all of those books, all the stories in all 3 books, there were probably a net total of 90 stories. They were all Caucasian. And so, and many of them were based on American myths and folktales. So my story was based on a Chinese folktale. And I just kind of saw it as my responsibility to add just a sprinkle of diversity to, a little bit of different color of paint on a very white canvas. And so a lot of times my mom was Caucasian and I could write about her family and her stories, but there are fewer people telling Asian American stories. And so sometimes I see that as my responsibility, my honor, my opportunity. Because usually when I write these stories, I do a ton of research and I learn a lot about myself. Thanks.
What was the most difficult part of the story to write about, and why?
This is a really silly thing. Two things. I'm writing about the Japanese internment, and I'm not Japanese. And so I had to get my brain around that for a little bit. And then I settled on, okay, I'm telling the story from the Chinese point of view, and Chinese Americans had a very different point of view of the internment than many Caucasian Americans. So I could own that. But if you're writing a book about the French Revolution, no one's mother had her head cut off by a guillotine. But there are people today whose parents and grandparents have firsthand experience in internment camps. And so you're writing someone's lived history, and those people are still alive. And so I had to really do my research. I had to do it right. And if I really feel like in the publishing industry, there's an emphasis to not screw anything up. And so publishers often want people just to write about their own experiences. And I really feel like if you can write about anything else and you can do the job really well, that's a great exercise of empathy. And you should give it a shot. But if you fail, you're going to pay a price, and you have to be willing to pay that price. And so I just did a ton of research, and I try not to write it as a morality play. I just tried to depict history as best I could and let people make their own judgment. That being stated, the first person to read the manuscript after my wife was Lawson Amada. And I reached out to him. He remembered me. He thought it was so cool that I was a writer. I sent him the manuscript, and he gave me his stamp of approval. And then I felt like I'd really done my job. The other thing is the Chinese side, and how I growing up, and oftentimes as an adult, I still don't feel Chinese enough. And I was so afraid that I don't know how this works in everyone's families, but in my family, my Chinese aunties are very honest. And so I can just walk in at Thanksgiving and my auntie would you got fat. And I'm like, thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate that. Or to my cousin, you need to fix your teeth. No one will marry you with those teeth. I'm like, okay, appreciate that. And they're like, what? If I don't tell her, no one's going to tell her. I'm her auntie. And it's kind of a stereotype that Asian aunties are brutally honest, and so are mine. And so I was terrified that I was going to write about Asian culture and have them just rip on me mercilessly. That being stated, when the book came out, I went to my great aunt's 100th birthday party, and I walked in and there was a stack of books 4 feet high for me to sign for all my aunties and their neighbors. So I think I passed the auntie test.
So I think we have time for just maybe one more question, and then kind of some final comments. We have a jillion questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to try to capture those, and maybe we can pass some of those on and be able to answer those at another time.
We can do a speed round, and I'll answer them in 2 seconds or something.
They're really long questions, Mr. Ford. So I'm going to let Malia pick the last question, and then maybe just a final word or two.
Okay, the last question is, why did you decide to make Henry and Keiko so young?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a fair question. I like coming of age moments, and for me, 12 was just a huge moment for me. Before 12, my mind was filled with Legos and comic books and football and things, childish things. And then at 12, I had a crush on a girl and had my heart broke, and it was almost the next week. One week I'm just thinking about comic books. The next week I'm walking around the playground just thinking, love sucks. It's just this moment. And for everyone, that moment is different. For some people, that might be when they're 40 or when they're 16. Also, that was the age that my dad was during Pearl Harbor. And that was the age that my great-grandfather was when he came to this country. And so it was kind of an important day. And also, I was kind of afraid of writing a little farther into their teens because the book just gets more hormonal, and that's not the story I wanted to tell. Other people tell that story better in YA books for sure. And so that's really why. It was weird when I queried agents, was trying to find an agent, this huge mega agent in New York contacted me and was going to represent me. But she said, I'm only going to represent you if you make Henry and Keiko like 17 or 18 so they can fully explore their relationship. And you know what that means. And I was just like, it's just not the book I want to write. And so I was just erring on the side of innocence. Also, sorry, no, I should just wrap it up. But if you've read To Kill a Mockingbird, Scout, the character Scout, she's like 8 years old. I mean, she reads like she's 12 in the book. But there's this thing that happens in books when your protagonist is really young. These big events happen around them, and the character doesn't know the gravity of it, but the reader gets it. And it's almost, it's the same thing like if you watch a scary movie and there's a person brushing their teeth and there's a killer behind the shower curtain with a knife. The audience sees it. The person brushing their teeth isn't aware, and it creates this dynamic tension. And so to have very young characters, a character like Henry, not really understanding why these people are being taken away, and yet the reader understands, it creates that same dynamic tension. So that's the many reasons why. Thank you very much.
So, Mr. Ford, there are all sorts of questions about history and whether your father was impacted by the Chinese Exclusion Act. There's another suggestion for a novel. If you need more writing ideas, we can send those along. Lots of questions and one of the things that I think is kind of a thread that goes through this is maybe a question about how do you think your experience of not just writing Hotel, but also having lived these next dozen years, really being kind of Jamie Ford, author of Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. How is the experience of writing, but then being identified, maybe that's your new button that you're wearing, it's not I am Chinese or I am American, I am the author of Hotel. How has that changed how do you think that's changed you? I guess that's the question.
Oh, I still pick up dog poop in the backyard. You know, I mean, like I haven't changed that much. My life, I can afford a few more creature comforts, but I've never really been into those. I'm more about humans. The thing I struggle with sometimes, I guess, is social responsibility. And I have a long talk I'm giving at Drexel University online now about that, in that I do have a lot of eyeballs now. I mean, not Kardashian level eyeballs, but people sometimes pay attention to what I say, and I am a historian, and it gives me an opportunity to not just entertain, but educate, illuminate, and hopefully edify people a little bit with that historical context. There are so many things that people don't know, especially when it comes to race and institutionalized racism. A family member of mine is an attorney, and he specializes in the criminalization of poverty. And he won a case before the Supreme Court that was set in Pagedale, Missouri. It's a community that's 98% Black. And this is outside of St. Louis. And the county passed these laws specifically to this neighborhood where they could ticket people for really ridiculous things. Like you could be ticketed for having a basketball hoop in your driveway. You could be ticketed for having more than 3 people at a barbecue. And so you ended up with 3,000 people in this community over a 6-year period being ticketed 32,000 times. It's insane. And so they gave police officers quotas saying, okay, you need to ticket 10 people every day. And so they would drive out of their jurisdictions, go to Pagedale, and ticket everybody. And so when people protest, and those protests turn to riots, I always ask why. Where's the anger coming from? And usually you'll find a reason, and it's something like that. That's something that's more modern, something that's historical. I tweeted this out, and it went like mega viral. And now there's someone who I'm advising, and she's writing a book about it. But in Pittsburgh, because people were talking about defund the police, and I mean, that's kind of a really bad term. I think better manage the police might be more appropriate. But in the 60s, you could, if you lived in a black neighborhood or a Chinese neighborhood, you could call the police and they might not show up. You could call an ambulance and they might not show up. This happened in Seattle in the ID, where it could take 30 minutes for an ambulance to arrive. So much so that a group created their own emergency response system of volunteers because that community was underserved. But in Pittsburgh, this community would basically, there were no ambulances in this community, this neighborhood. Ambulance duties were left to police officers. And so if you're having a heart attack, the police may or may not come and pick you up. And you may or may not want to, as a person of color, want to call the police. So some people in this community contacted a doctor at a nearby university who had developed this new thing called CPR that was not widely used. And together they created a volunteer ambulance service that would perform life-saving procedures on the way to the hospital. And they saved so many lives that those ambulance services were requested in white neighborhoods. So you had these new ambulances driven by black people in white neighborhoods saving their lives. And so the modern ambulance system that we rely on was created in this black community. And that's a story that's just has not been told. And so as a writer, sometimes I recognize those things and I want to write that. And in this case, there's a woman named Carrie Dickerson, African-American writer, former EMT, and she's writing that story. And so I think there's just so many stories that need to be told. And I think an informed population is a better population. That is a long answer, sorry. But thank you for hanging in there.
Well, Mr. Ford, we just want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day today, for responding to Ms. Hannigan's tweet, because she's the only person in the English department I know who actually knows how to tweet, and to being willing to come and share some of your time with us. We have lots and lots of questions that we're going to, at Bellarmine, we'll try to pull those together and see if we can also continue this discussion. So all of those of you out in Lion Land know that we're going to continue some of our discussion and debriefing next week. But Mr. Ford, we just want to thank you so very much for joining us today, and Malia for stepping up and reading questions, and for Ms. Henderson's class especially, and Ms. Hannigan's class, and a lot of the other English classes for sending questions ahead of time to get us going. So thank you very much. Take good care, and we hope to see you soon.
Okay, everybody. Bye, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye.